Hi everyone, Zach here. It's hot in here, so sorry that I'm sweating around. But anyway, we want to find out today if it is possible to create pretty high resolution sculptings in Blender while maintaining a fluent and smooth running viewport. And spoiler ahead, it is possible. This cowboy creature I just finished a few days ago for the latest Wild West ArtStation challenge, and for this challenge I wanted to create a high resolution sculpting in Blender. But if you are just using dynamic topology, at some point if you put the resolution too high, it starts to lag and then sculpting is no fun anymore. But I have a nice workflow for you that you can put the poly count pretty high and still be able to sculpt nice details, but without dynamic topology. So this is not a full tutorial on how to create this creature. I just want to show you how you achieve this very high resolution, the workflow behind that, and some cool tips and tricks along the way. If you want to learn how to create such high resolution creatures from scratch, check out my Mastering Sculpting workshop. And if you sculpt a lot, then definitely check out my free sculpting cheat sheet with all the important sculpting shortcuts. The links you find in the video description. So, before we get started, I want to thank the sponsor for this video. It is Cycles Material Vault. It's a library of over 100 pretty cool Cycles materials. Super useful if you quickly want to shade your scene. And the nice thing is, for a lot of these materials you don't need a UV map. Let's for example take this high resolution dynamic topology sculpting with no UV map. I just drag and drop the material on it and adjust a few sliders, and with a nice lighting setup this looks incredible. I've used Cycles Material Vault in many of my projects already and I can totally recommend it. And the nice thing, you get 10% off if you follow the link in the video description. And by the way, Cycles Material Vault will be updated for Blender 2.8 and Eevee. And if you already purchased this product, then you get all future updates for free. More infos and 10% off, check the link in the video description. A huge thank you to Cycles Material Vault, and now let's get started with the tutorial. Alright, here we have the creature in a state where I was done with all the major shapes, like the muzzle structures here, all the limbs are joined and stuff like this. So I was done with all the major shapes, but all the fine details like the scales or the skin details are missing. So, and this is really important. Before you go on with this method, which I want to show you right now, you have to make sure that everything is in place with the major shapes, because later on you can't easily add new stuff, like for example if you want to add the ears or horns or want to cut off something or just want to make big changes. So you have to be aware that this is not really easily possible afterwards. So we are done with that, but we have a small problem here. As you can see, the density of the mesh is different. So here we have a higher density and here we have a lower resolution, as you can see. But if we are using this method here, this will show up in the final mesh. So let's first subdivide this and smooth the surface a bit so that we have less troubles later on. For this, I switch to sculpt mode. Let's take a look in the tool shelf. Here, let's enable dynamic topology. Set relative detail to constant detail. Then we have a fixed resolution for the subdivision. And right now, if I use the eyedropper here and click on my mesh, you can see on different areas I have a different subdivision size. So, but approximately it's 150, I would say. And I now want to subdivide the whole mesh with this resolution here. So I simply click on this detail flat fill. So according to the power of your computer and how high you subdivide the mesh, this can take a short while. But right now I don't want to achieve a high resolution here. I just want to achieve that the whole surface has the same resolution. So as you can see right now here, this still looks pretty much the same as before. But if I switch back to object mode and enable wire here and draw all edges, you can see that all these faces here are subdivided too. So all we need to do now is to smooth out the surface, and that we can do with the smooth modifier. So let's increase the factor to 1, and then let's repeat this. Let's try 10. This looks good already. So as you can see, now everything is smoothed out. Certainly we lose a bit of details, but we can add them again later on with the very high resolution. Okay, let's apply this. And now comes the interesting part. How can we now achieve this high resolution? I enable my second layer here, and I disable all the secondary elements. So we have the sculpting on layer 1 and this object here on layer 2. This is a retopology object. That means if I switch to edit mode, you can see this has a much better topology, although it's not perfect. But if we take a look again on this object here, the topology is not really good. That means if we want to animate this, rig this, add textures, UV maps and so on, this is not really possible. So we have to create this retopology object. That means I basically rebuild the whole creature with a better looking mesh and with much less polygons, as you can see up here. So if you want to know how to make such a retopology, I have other video which explains at least how to set up everything. And if you, for example, don't want to spend hours on creating such a retopology object, I can recommend the tool Instant Meshes, which creates a relatively good looking retopology automatically, which is maybe not really useful for animation and so on. But if you just want to create a still render with your creature, maybe pose this a bit, then this is more than enough. It's free, you can download this, link in the video description. Then you just have to export your model here from Blender as OBJ file, then import this into the tool, then click a few buttons and then export it as OBJ again and import it here into Blender. And then you have basically such an object here with a little bit different topology than this one here, also a bit more polygons probably. But this will also work fine. There are already many tutorials about instant meshes out there, and in my mastering sculpting workshop there's also a part where I explain this more in detail. So, however, we have now our retopology object, but as you can see it's really rough in resolution and not really represents all the nice sculpting shapes we have on the sculpting mesh. And now, in order to get all the nice shapes from the sculpting mesh to the retopo mesh, we have to project the retopo mesh onto the sculpting mesh. So retopo mesh is selected. Let's go to the modifiers and let's add the multi-resolution modifier. The multi-res works similar like the subsurf modifier, but we can also sculpt on all the finer subdivisions we add with the multi-res modifier. So right now let's click on subdivide, maybe 2 times for now. Later on we can increase this. And then we add a second modifier, the shrink wrap modifier. This projects one mesh onto another. So let's use the target object here. It's the sculpting object. And now you can see something is happening there. So let's disable the sculpting mesh. And you can see now our retopology object has the shape of the sculpting mesh. But as you can see here, it looks a little bit weird. And because of that, let's change the mode here from nearest surface point to project. Then it looks even worse for a second, but we have to enable a negative under direction as well. And then as you can see, it looks pretty perfect. Just in tiny areas here where polygons are pretty close, you can see some little errors, but we can fix them in sculpt mode later on. So, but now we don't have more detail than before, and in order to achieve higher detail levels, we just have to subdivide the multi-res modifier again. Higher, I mean more. So now I have 5 subdivisions. This was roughly the resolution I used for my final sculpting, but for this tutorial I want to go even higher. So let's set this to 6. So as you can see, with 6 subdivisions, the poly count drastically increases here, but it will still be possible to work with this sculpting. The nice thing of the multi-res modifier is that we can easily reduce the subdivisions. So for example, if you're done with sculpting on the mesh here, you can simply decrease the subdivisions here, and then everything runs totally smooth, or you just disable the multi-res completely. And as you can see, the base mesh, the Retopo mesh here, is not affected at all. This is still the same as I had before. That means if I, for example, later on add an armature to pose the creature, I basically just pose this low resolution object, and all the high sculpting details we will add later will put on top of all that. And also if we, for example, want to add seams for UV map, this is super easy to do because the mesh here is pretty low in resolution. So, but the big downside of the whole process here is that I'm now not able to add any geometry. So if I would add some creases or loop cuts here and there, this could add damage to the multi-res sculpting. So be aware of this, and that's the reason why I told you just go on with this method when you're completely done with dynamic topology sculpting with the main shapes of the body here. Alright, now let's increase the subdivisions, enable the multi-res. If you deal with these high subdivisions, this can always take a while if you enable the multi-res modifier again. So, and now comes the magic. Because we have one little problem left here. Right now we still have the sculpting in our scene, but it would be pretty useless to add 2 sculptings here because then the poly count of our scene increases a lot. So I want to delete the sculpting mesh here so that I only have the Retopo mesh left. But right now we need the sculpting mesh because we use the shrink wrap modifier. And this projects all the geometry on the sculpting mesh. But here's a magic little trick. If the multi-res modifier is above the shrink wrap modifier and I now hit apply on the shrink wrap modifier, all this information from the shrink wrap modifier will be stored inside the multi-res modifier, and we will not affect the basic retopology mesh. And yeah, since we have a high resolution here, this can also take a short while. So the multi-res now has all the information. If I disable this, you can see we still have our Retopo mesh, and if I enable this, all the nice details are stored in the multi-res modifier. So now when I move the viewport, you can see this is somehow extremely slow. And there's just a very simple reason for this, and this is this orange outline we have here. Because as far as I know, for this orange outline, Blender has to draw this object twice. So, and for example, if I disable this, you can see somehow this is super fluent, but certainly we have to select the creature sometimes. So what we can do is press N, go to display, and then disable outline selected. Now we can select the object, but there's not this outline around the creature, and you can see it runs super smooth. Let's change the material so we don't have this blue creature all the time. And now we can delete the creature sculpting here because we don't need this anymore. So now let's switch to sculpt mode to see how this performs while sculpting. By the way, this here is the Pi Menus add-on, which you can enable in the user preferences to quickly switch between the modes. So you can see that the viewport is not running totally smooth, but there's something we can do. Let's go to options here, options, and then we can enable fast navigate. This is only possible if you're using the multi-res modifier. So that means if I now rotate my view, it will immediately switch to a lower resolution and we can fluently navigate our viewport here. So, but as you can see, there's another little error. The sculpting brush is following pretty slow. And I just discovered that the reason for this is the screencast add-on which I'm using here to show the shortcuts I'm pressing. So for now, for this part, I have to disable this because if I stop this, you can see it now runs totally smooth. So for some reason, this is slowing down the performance. So, but I try to explain all the important shortcuts I'm using right now. So let's go to tools. Let's increase the strength here. And now let's see how fluently I can sculpt on here. As you can see, this runs really smooth. I can go really fast. So as you can see, this is a typical problem here. If I move really fast, we have these edges in here. What we can do about this is go to stroke and increase the input samples. That means if I move fast, then Blender will move the mouse or move the stroke a bit slower than your mouse speed, and then you get a smoother stroke. And as you can see, you can now really smoothly sculpt extreme high details here. So let's redo this with Ctrl Z, and now let's sculpt on here. You can change, by the way, the size of your brush with F and the strength of your brush with Shift F. So now let's use the crease brush here, make it smaller, and now let's try to add some details as I did for the final sculpting here. So for the scales, for example, I just added these lines here. Maybe you can do it even stronger. And as you can see, this is running super fluently. So, and after this, I just used the clay strips brush, for example, with pretty high strength, and then added some geometry over here. So as you can imagine, this was quite a tedious process and took a lot of time. Maybe you can also create a scales brush and use this, but I wanted to use this method to make every scale look a little bit different. Then I smoothed out the area with holding down Shift and using the smooth brush. And then with the inverted crease brush, I hold down Control now, I added this extra edge to one side of the scales to lift this up a bit. And in this way, I created the scales. But now let's see how we can add even more details super fast. So let's take the Sculpt Draw brush, go to Texture, add a new one. Then over here, let's open a new texture. And I have a bunch of brushes here, which you can also download for free. Just check my video where I show you how to create those brushes on your own. And in the video description of the video, you can download all these brushes, which were created by the community. Awesome, right? So let's take the skin brush here, open the image, and now let's set things up. So I just don't want to have view plane because then the brush would be projected from my position, and then we have this stretching here. So let's set this to area plane, then it will always use the normal of the geometry. So if I sculpt from this direction here, the brush stroke will still point upwards basically, so we don't have any stretching in here. Then I use random, that means every dot from my stroke will be rotated randomly. And then let's go to stroke and increase the spacing between the dots, so I don't have just a stroke with many dots, because then we can't really see the skin. But let's make this a bit bigger. So now the strength is way too strong. Let's try 0.2. And as you can see right now, if I zoom back or zoom in, my brush will be bigger or smaller because it stays the same according to my screen size, but not according to the zoom position basically where I am right now. So I enable this logger symbol. That means it will now scale the brush according to the zoom step I'm using here. So if I'm closer, it will be bigger, and if I'm further away, it will be smaller. So, and now, as you can see, I can sculpt these nice details. If you're sculpting here in the center, I would probably disable symmetry lock, so we don't have this symmetrical shapes over here. Now, as you can see, we can sculpt pretty high details. Certainly this kind of details you can also create with a bump map later on, but I somehow prefer to do it in sculpt mode because it feels a little bit more natural and flexible. So just as showcase here to give you an idea what is possible with Blender. Yeah, and in this way we can add a lot of details. Let's duplicate this brush up here and remove the texture. Go to stroke and increase the jittering. Then we have these random dots here, as you can see. Make this maybe a bit stronger. And then we can add some further skin imperfections here, maybe for the creature, to add more details. And we can even go pretty small with this right now to add all these tiny little details. And certainly we can use also other brush textures. For this one I also used this one here or this one. Let's use this one here to add some scars. And here I would suggest to change the stroke mode to anchored. Then we can draw this one dot, basically scale it and rotate it until we release our mouse or pen. But here you can see we have this dent in here, which is not that nice because we just want to have this scar here. And in order to achieve this, we can go to texture and go with the sample bias into a negative direction. And then you can see it will basically remove this dent and then we only go downwards. So if I use -1, and then we can add this nice scars, for example. So now we could use as many sculpting brushes as we like. And as you can see, it still runs super fluent because we will not add new geometry. The mesh is already subdivided as high as we need it. And yeah, it's working great, as you can see. So, and when you're done with your sculpting and maybe want to add some clothing or whatever to the creature, you can easily go to the multi-res modifier, reduce the preview subdivisions, and then everything runs smoothly. So one thing we have to consider, if we are using high resolution sculptings here in Blender, the blend file will be pretty big. So right now this one here is 350 megabytes, and this can be a problem if you save in versions, for example version 1, 2, 3, and then every file is 300 to 500 megabytes big, and then certainly in short times you have gigabytes of space wasted. But there's a nice little trick what you can use. You can save the multi-res information externally. So if I click on here, I can type in a name, and then I save this in the same folder as my creature. So we basically outsourced the multi-res sculpting right now, and now this file is only 9 megabytes big, and we have this external sculpting file which is 330 megabytes big. And now if you save versions of this file, it will always link to the external sculpting file. Certainly then you can't save the iterations of the sculpting process. This you have to be aware of. So if you, for example, save different versions and all are linking to this file, then the sculpting progress is always the same in all the files. I have to say that for this creature, I used a little different process because after sculpting all the details, I wanted to be able to, on the one side, remove the foot here because he has this mechanical foot. And on the one ear, I wanted to remove this little flesh parts here. But certainly I also could have done this before I went over to sculpt all the fine details. So I definitely recommend to use the process I've just showed you. But for this sculpting, I did it in another way. So let's quickly switch to sculpt mode. And what I did here, I enabled dynamic topology, set the resolution to 400, and then I detail flood filled the whole mesh. That means we have a pretty high resolution applied on the mesh. The detail flood filling takes a short while, a few minutes probably, according to your system power. But then if you after this disable dynamic topology, you're also able to sculpt all these details here super fluently on the surface. But certainly the mesh is high resolution and we can't reduce the subdivisions here. So after this, I also created my Retopology here and basically did the same process. So I used the multi-res modifier, then the shrink wrap modifier, then I switched the mode to project, negative, also enabled, and then we can subdivide the multi-res again. So I just go up to 5 right now, then I apply the shrink wrap, and then I can delete the high-res sculpting. So as you can see, now we also have all the detail information stored inside the multi-res. The workflow is pretty similar, but I just added all the details before I used the multi-res. But yeah, I just find out that there's no really reason to do this way here, because if you know from the beginning that you want to add some non-symmetrical parts like this removed foot here or this wound up here, then just do it before you go over to the multi-res sculpting. But as you can see, both methods are working. But I think if you're just going with the multi-res method I just showed you before and then sculpt all the details with the multi-res modifier on, I think then you can go even higher with all the fine details. So, and then after I was done with the sculpting, I added all the clothing here, the gun, the head, the beard, the cigar, the eyes, and the mechanical foot down here, as you can see. And yeah, I just wanted to have a nice pose, so I also added this armature system to the creature. And since we're using the multi-res modifier here, the original mesh is super low in resolution, so it was relatively easy to pose this. Yeah guys, as you can see, you can create pretty high resolution sculptings in Blender with a fluent running viewport. Certainly this also depends on the power of your system, but in general I think if you know the workflow, you can create some pretty decent looking sculptings in Blender. So, and if you feel now that you really want to push yourself into sculpting in Blender, then definitely check out my Mastering Sculpting workshop. It's fully packed with over 60 videos, starting with a full introduction into the sculpt mode in Blender, and it ends with all the high quality sculpting tips you need to know, plus an additional chapter about procedural shading and rendering your sculptings. Also, as mentioned, download the free Blender sculpting cheat sheet and don't forget to grab the 10% off for Cycles Material Vault. Guys, thanks a lot for watching and for all your support. See you in the next video. Goodbye.